So why is this question important? Look, there's no doubt anymore. There's absolutely, it's unequivocal that the foods that we choose to eat do have an impact in terms of the environment, and particularly here where you're in a country that is quite literally spontaneously combusting about twice a year at this point. These things, I was going to go with that image of the burnt, charred baby kangaroo, and I thought that's a bit too much. Sorry. So it is an important question. This isn't necessarily, oh, we have to adopt diets that are, for example, exclusively 100% plant-based or vegan, but it's probably something we should be thinking about in terms of our overall food selections. Then there's also the nonsense, right? I mean, is actually shifting to a plant-based diet going to really have an impact? As Game Changers claimed, so we need to get to the bottom of that as well. And then the reality is, most of you here, coaches, there is the possibility that inadvertently people that are choosing to follow any degree of either vegetarian or vegan diet may actually be under-consuming protein just by virtue of the lack of animal-sourced protein in their diet or their iteration. And the thing is, a vegetarian diet encompasses any range of definitions. You could lacto-vegetarian, so you consume dairy. Ovo-vegetarian, you consume eggs. Lacto-ovo, you consume eggs and dairy. Pescatarian, you consume fish, and you might actually consume fish, eggs, and dairy as well. And there's no distinction made in our recommendations in terms of general population health for dietary protein intake. So that Gen-Pop RDA of about 0.8 grams per kilo of body weight isn't made with any sort of distinction based on the type of diet an individual is eating. So again, inadvertently, people just might, even if they're interested in and partaking in recreational or even more serious physical activity or recreational athletics, may actually be under-consuming dietary protein intake. And finally, and possibly most importantly, some of us just kind of want to have this windswept look, raw in nature and all its glory. Some of us just want to be jacked. So yeah, there's a range of reasons why this question over protein source in the diet really does matter. So I want to introduce a couple of key considerations in terms of, we're going to be working through all of these as we work through the evidence as far as dietary protein intake goes. Obviously, digestibility is going to be a really important factor, and it's going to be something that I'm going to spend a little bit of time on in a couple of slides explaining amino acid digestibility in terms of what the implications are for plant-sourced versus animal-sourced protein. And a lot of this has to do with previous methods of measuring protein digestibility, which differed based on whether it was measuring small intestinal digestibility or whether it was measuring digestibility in the large intestine and the colon. And there are actually significant differences between where you measure that we're feeding into some of the estimations. And that will relate to availability then in terms of bioavailability, and we'll define what bioavailability is. And then the actual dose, so to speak, right? The actual level of intake, both in terms of total diet and then specific levels of intake if we're talking about supplemental dietary protein intake, which most of the research has not used food-based interventions. So the vast majority of research is using supplemental protein in various forms. And then efficacy, how good are these sources? Then ultimately, yes, okay, it's important that we consider digestibility, bioavailability, and the actual dose, and that will relate to digestibility and bioavailability. But ultimately, we're also interested just in outcomes, okay? So how effective are protein sources at actually translating into either muscle protein synthesis, actual accretion of muscle, or indeed performance-based outcomes, strength, power, endurance, recoverability, and otherwise. So as far as the digestion and availability, there's a couple of factors that go into a definition of bioavailability. So one is digestibility, the net absorption of an amino acid. And I'm specifically referring to amino acids here for a reason that I'll explain, as opposed to just crude, intact, whole protein that we would consume through diet. The actual chemical integrity as a structure, so the proportion of that amino acid that's actually absorbed and available for utilization and uptake into skeletal muscle or otherwise. And then freedom from interference in metabolism. So different foods might have other components of that food that might actually act to inhibit or influence the digestibility and metabolism of that. And an example that we look at in one of the studies, for example, is wheat protein. So in a food form, it constitutes a lot of the human diet. A surprising amount of our dietary protein intake, because of our food sources, would come from wheat. But in a whole food form, not particularly efficacious in terms of its bioavailability. But if you hydrolyze it and create a supplement out of it, it's actually pretty good and comparable in terms of digestibility to an animal protein. So those factors matter. So a lot of the argument that you'll see, particularly between the people that really seem to have a skin in the kind of animal versus plant debate crowd, will come down to these metrics that we've had for assessing protein quality in a broad sense. The earliest, this was in 1989, the Joint Committee of the FAO and WHO came up with this PDCAAS, the Protein Digestibility Corrected Amino Acid Score. This was based off measuring amino acids in the large intestine, in the colon. So they'd gone through the small intestine where the vast majority of amino acid digestion occurs. And the problem with this was it was taking a single value for crude protein. So the protein that you would consume in a food was looking at that, right? Assuming that that's what's being consumed. And then it was measuring amino acid availability in the large intestine and trying to come up with basically a differential that was an estimate of how efficient that protein was at being digested and absorbed. So the problem with that is it didn't actually account for individual amino acids having different bioavailability. The other problem was once food gets to the large intestine, it encounters the microbiome. But basically we have a storehouse of bacteria that would metabolize those amino acids even further. So it wasn't even an accurate reflection of dietary metabolism of protein and certainly small intestine metabolism. So these limitations were pretty much recognized almost from the moment that this was published and updated then in the late 90s in terms of the digestible indispensable amino acid score. And so this was based on measuring amino acid availability at the end of the small intestine, at the terminal ileum. And so it was looking at that, but it was also looking specifically at individual amino acids rather than just making a calculation based off, okay, this person ate Greek yogurt. Let's look at the crude protein content of that Greek yogurt. Let's say there's 10 grams per 100 grams, and let's look at the amino acids that made it to the large intestine, which is basically what that was doing. So this was looking at the amino acids that were left over at the end of the small intestine, which means it was more of a true reflection of the digestion of that amino acid and the absorption and metabolism of it that had gone on in the small intestine. And it also treated each individual amino acid almost as an individual nutrient, which is important. Now, it also has its limitations. It's really difficult to actually measure this in live humans. So one thing that I'm going to caution in this is anyone that's coming down really hard on assuming that protein quality is something that we can hang our hat on, treat it with a little bit of skepticism. There's a lot that we don't know in terms of amino acid metabolism at this point, and there's some ongoing research. So this is just an example of how this can play out in real life. So this is using the DIAAS, and this is a comparison between milk and between soy. And what you can see, and this is why it's important to treat individual amino acids as almost individual nutrients, is you can see, say, just as an example, so the highest concentration of an amino acid, the highest absorption was for tyrosine in milk, 99.3, and the lowest was for threonine in soy. So what we're seeing here, and even if you just look at any of these, is that between the two of them, they just have a degree of different absorption. Now, with some of the emphasis on nitrogen digestibility alone, if we only look at that, which is basically using that kind of old metric, you would say, wow, there's a big difference here in terms of total nitrogen digestibility, and amino acids and protein from milk is much more absorbed than protein from soy. But if you treat each individual amino acid as an individual nutrient, and you take that individual amino acid and you average it, you actually got much less of a difference between milk and soy. So this is basically just an example of how each individual food, if we just look at its crude protein content, we kind of potentially miss the forest for the trees. So they all have unique amino acid compositions that's different based on the actual source of the food, and even within a class of animal versus plant. Yeah?
Oh, sorry. I didn't realize questions were at the end. Just quickly, is someone's exposure to a certain food, is there any literature in that case that if someone was to repeatedly consume a certain food, their guts might be able to better obtain the amino acids from that?
Not particularly. Once it gets to the large intestine, sure, because the foods that we eat become substrate for various bacterial species in the gut, whether that's fiber or protein or certain forms of fat as well, will increase or decrease populations relative to that substrate. But in terms of protein, we're talking about largely small intestinal absorption. So it's not going to really. The more you eat yogurt doesn't make you more efficient at absorbing amino acids from yogurt. It's more to do with what other factors might be present in a food matrix, for example. And it's really ultimately more to do with the overall amino acid composition of that actual food. So main take-home point, dietary amino acids need to be treated as individual nutrients, and we're going to end up talking about certain amino acids, leucine in particular, a lot in this. I'm not going to labor this too much. This is just an example of why the book on protein bioavailability and metabolism is just not closed yet. It's not settled science. So this is Thomas Preston and a group have been doing a lot of stable isotope research in India in populations that are exposed to malnutrition, often traditionally vegetarian Hindu populations. And stable isotopes are a really awesome tool to be able to use. It's literally creating a tracer label that we can watch when we actually analyze it, go into and out of different compartments in the body. So it's a really advanced and exciting methodology for nutrition research to more precisely quantify the metabolic fate of foods and nutrients we eat. The whole point is that they took pea, mung bean, and chickpeas in this population, did stable isotopes. This is a free-living population. And in terms of the indispensable amino acid score, what they found was that it was actually lower than they expected using stable isotope analysis. And this is in the context of these foods being cooked. So a lot of the scores for amino acid quality use raw legumes in particular to analyze that. And were not really accurate metrics because the method by which we cook or process a food will actually impact on its amino acid bioavailability. Now, this shouldn't be over-extrapolated for our purposes because this is a population at risk of nutritional insufficiency, and it's not exactly relative to, us. But it's just to say that the actual book isn't closed on this, and it's not settled science that we know everything that we need to. And really, in certain populations, it's going to require a higher proportion. If they are exclusively reliant on more vegetable sources of protein, it will require a higher proportion of intake of those foods to maintain, or the addition of really minor quantities of animal foods. As they suggested in this study, just the addition of 200 ml of milk or eggs, or 2 eggs a day, because they consume milk and eggs in that population, would be sufficient to avoid stunting. But it's just to say that, this idea that we can hang our hat on protein quality really is far from settled at this point, and the stable isotope analysis research probably was going to uncover some more in this story. So, okay, if we use these scores, are people who follow vegetarian or otherwise diets disadvantaged? Well, this was an analysis that came out. It was only a cross-sectional study, but they took vegetarian athletes and omnivore athletes, and they looked at their protein intake. And if we look at this indispensable amino acid score as a percentage, you can see the vegetarians had just about 90% of their as a indispensable amino acid score from the diet, whereas the actual omnivores had basically practically 100%. And again, that is something that you might expect if we're just considering that metric. But actually, if we just look at total protein intake, that differed. Right? And it differed in terms of thresholds that we know to be relevant in a way that's actually meaningful. So again, is this just a lower quality protein diet, or are these athletes just not consuming sufficient protein, and that's translating when we use these metrics? So that's important to consider. So when this study ultimately then looked at correlations between muscle mass and strength, and which correlated with protein availability, all they were really showing was a correlation with total protein intake ultimately being higher in people consuming omnivorous diets because of their food sources. So there's a concept that I'm going to introduce now, and there's a couple of additional layers on it, seeds that I'll just plant in your head at the outset, because as we start to go through the intervention evidence, multiple of these themes are coming up. This is the kind of the leucine trigger hypothesis, and it's, oh, what is that? That's a bit weird. Okay, so there's this, there's a bit of gray here, basically, which you can't see on this, possibly because of the lighting, but it's fine. So basically, what we're saying here is this: there's this gray area here, right, which is a range of leucine specifically as an amino acid intake within which there is this relatively maximal stimulation. Certainly, muscle protein synthesis is a proxy response. And particularly whey protein, because of its amino acid composition, or if we use an isolated whey protein powder, you'll get this big spike that will go initially straight into that domain of this leucine trigger range and start to trigger these responses. And then you potentially have a difference if we're talking about whole foods, because whole foods you may not necessarily get the whole dose. And then this arrow shaded area here is really indicating the kind of unknown area right now, which is the fact that the vast majority of studies are using supplemented, isolated forms of a protein, irrespective of whether that's whey, soy, or otherwise. And we don't really know much about food matrix effects in terms of muscle protein synthesis. So there's a couple of things that are important in this. One is that the achieving of that range of leucine intake in this certainly post-exercise period is not sufficient in and of itself to explain the entirety of the adaptive responses that occur from dietary protein intake, particularly where it's combined with exercise. The second thing is that flowing from this, a kind of simplified model came through, and you can kind of understand where you're looking at some of the research on whey and milk proteins, where this came from, but the idea being, right, we want this really leucine-rich milk protein, for example, and what we want to do after an exercise bout is we want to flood the circulation with amino acids, right? We want to just have this big burst of amino acidemia, and that's going to be everything we need. And that doesn't entirely explain it either. I'm going to look at some research later that looks at these kind of food matrix effects. So the total amino acid, just flooding the blood with amino acids, isn't in and of itself sufficient to explain it. Leucine is important, but it's not sufficient in and of itself to explain the entirety of the responses. And this is going to be relevant when we think of even factors like total protein dose, which is going to be really important overall in this evidence. So this concept is important. Most of what we're going to be focusing on is going to be related to supplemental protein powders, because that's just what the research has done. There is a little bit of a gray area over whether there's food matrix effects. There's suggestive evidence so far that there perhaps is. And single cause explanations for the potential difference in the anabolic and adaptive effects of different protein sources are not just explained by a single variable like leucine, and are not just explained by flooding the blood with amino acids after training, and that being a reflection of the quality of the protein if we're looking at something like an indispensable amino acid score. So let's kind of start to work through some of these examples of how this plays out. Again, this is a review of kind of plant versus animal protein. And yeah, sure, if we take any of these scores, this looked helpfully at the difference between these two. So animal proteins with the old scoring format all had a score of 100. You couldn't go over 100 in that old scoring system. And then you've got the updated indispensable amino acid score here. And you can see the animal-sourced proteins here and plant-sourced proteins here. And you can see a difference in these quality scores, but it's not necessarily always a reflection of their digestibility. And importantly, this is looking, for example, at even things like cooked or pea protein concentrate, where you get a digestibility percentage of 99%. And again, we'll look at some of the research that's compared pea proteins to whey proteins. So it's overly simplistic to assume that the quality score, which is based on an assessment of amino acid profile, is sufficient to explain potential differences in plant versus animal sources of protein. We need to look really more at outcomes and direct comparisons to try and parse this literature. So let's start doing that. Okay, so some of the early research was commonly comparing whey to soy protein. And sure, this is blood leucine levels in response to whey, soy, and casein. And you can see the whey far and away results in this big enrichment of circulating leucine. We pressed the wrong button, went for the red pen. And so then you can see, obviously, the soy protein and the casein not really having that kind of matched effect with whey. But this is where leucine is relevant in this context, in the overall amino acid profile, because this was a study where it was just the total protein dose between these various protein sources that was used. And you can see that the leucine content of the whey was much greater than that of the casein or the soy. And so obviously there's differences again between the casein and the soy, which have the same amount of leucine. So again, this is just iterating that leucine is not explaining the entirety of a response. But it is important enough that once you start to particularly get over about 2 grams, you might get more of a certainly enrichment in blood leucine response as well, but also in stimulation of muscle protein synthesis from this. So a lot of this early research was always comparing whey to soy. And this was another example of a study where the two were compared in terms of muscle protein synthesis rates. But this was in elderly men. And what was interesting was they looked at different doses, then they looked at obviously the difference between rest and exercise responses. And basically what you have here, let's say at 20 grams of a dose, right? So this is the soy at rest. And then this is the soy after exercise, and then that's the whey. So you can see that the 20-gram dose of whey is having a much greater impact in terms of the fractional synthesis rates, so muscle protein synthesis rates. And you can see here that actually, if we're looking at the difference between rest, the soy protein is literally having no greater effect on muscle protein synthesis than the whey does at rest. So this is soy after exercise having the same effect as just having whey when you've no exercise. And then you get up the dose to about 40 grams, and again, you get this whey response in terms of fractional synthesis, muscle protein synthesis after exercise at 40 grams, and you get a greater response at 40 grams of soy protein than you got at 20, but again, it's no different to whey at that dose at rest. Again, this is something where the dose of protein is being compared as an intervention, but not necessarily accounting for the potential differences in amino acid composition. Overall, it does appear with some of these early studies that that was the most consistent finding, was whey outperformed soy. It also outperformed other sources of animal source proteins like casein, for example. But again, these are really only considering the same level of dose and not necessarily considering some of the other amino acid composition factors. So this was a study then that took, and the other thing actually, before we move on from this, the other thing about this study in elderly men, we know that there's this kind of age-related decline in some of the responsiveness to muscle protein synthesis in particular, the stimulatory effect of that. But in this particular study, protein was at 1 gram per kilo of body weight. So as a total dose of protein, forgetting how much they were actually feeding them as the intervention, they weren't really getting thresholds that we would really want to see if we're talking about some of these responses. But this study did. So this, again, compared whey and soy in young adults in the context of resistance training, in the context of consuming total dietary protein intake of 1.6 to 1.8 grams a day. They're thresholds that are probably ringing in everyone's ears here as like, yeah, that sounds pretty good as far as a total protein dose. And what they found was this is lean tissue mass, whey, soy, the placebo. There was no difference in terms of lean tissue mass accretion. Squat 1 rep max went up in both, and it went up to a greater extent than in the placebo group. So the placebo group were still following the resistance training program. They're still getting a benefit, but it's not to the adaptive extent that the whey or soy protein, but importantly, no difference between these groups. So when we've got a high total daily protein intake, hitting thresholds that are important, and we're adding additional supplemental protein on top of that already adequate intake of total dietary protein, there was no difference between whey and soy. So these interventions are starting now in terms of this to give us slightly more of a bigger picture in terms of the relationship between the source of protein relative to the dose that's used as an intervention, but also, more importantly, relative to the dose of actual total daily intake that's being achieved. This then was an intervention that compared pea protein. So in a supplement, in an isolated supplemental form, pea protein actually has quite a lot of leucine enrichment. And what they looked at was a same relative dose of pea proteins versus whey protein. And they were looking at a range of outcomes. I've chosen this one just to illustrate because actually all we're interested in is bicep thickness. So this is bicep thickness, and we can see over the course of the 84 days of the intervention, the pea, there was no significant difference between the pea and the whey, but the difference between over time, you could start to see a greater improvement in that pea protein group compared to the whey. And so in this study, between the compositional amino acid content of the respective interventions, the whey and the pea protein were essentially equivalent in terms of its leucine profile, and the other amino acid profiles of pea protein don't appear to be a limitation to its impact on muscle protein synthesis, and indeed on actual kind of hard endpoints like lean muscle accretion. So this then was looking at another plant source of protein, looking at rice protein. Now, rice protein is not as good as pea as far as its overall amino acid composition and leucine enrichment. So what they did here was just provide a much higher dose of the rice protein. It was 48 grams of rice protein a day. And that total protein dose was designed to be able to then match the leucine content specifically, which is what this study set out to do, between the whey and the rice protein. And there was a range of outcomes in terms of lean body mass, body fat percentage, bicep thickness, quadricep thickness. Obviously, we prefer the bicep thickness outcome. And again, you can see rice in the clear bars and the whey protein in the gray bars. And really across the board in any of these outcomes, there's no significant difference between the two protein sources. And they've all had a benefit at that level of threshold of the matched leucine content between different doses, total doses of these protein sources. So for some plant proteins, it could be that actually there's just more that is required to be consumed in order to achieve kind of outcomes that will be comparable to whey. So this study came back to comparing pea protein, and one of the stated kind of intentions of this paper by this group was that previous study that we looked at, giving the guts of 50 grams of a protein powder to someone's probably not that ecologically valid. It's a lot of protein powder to be chugging down. So is pea protein potentially a better choice? Because you can consume a 25-gram serving of that, which is probably what most people would, 20 to 25 grams of a serving is what they would be consuming with a whey. And this compared to the same dose, 25 grams of whey and pea protein, and they had strength outcomes as well as body composition outcomes, and no difference. So both groups improved squat and deadlift and body composition, and there was no difference between the groups. And again, if we look at the overall compositional amino acid profile, leucine content pretty much similar between groups, but even other amino acids that potentially could be relevant, also fairly well balanced between the whey and the pea protein supplementation. So it's maybe not necessarily the source as much as some of these additional characteristics. And certainly for pea protein, the two studies that have used this have shown equivalent effects at doses, at actual doses of the total supplemental intervention that are more similar to whey and don't require just jacking up the total dose of that protein powder in order to achieve the same effect. So what about other potential kind of adaptations if we come back to rice protein? So we've looked at pea protein, that looks pretty good overall, and it's possibly because of its amino acid composition. And then rice protein, we've seen that previous study which looked at the just massive dose of 50 grams a day. So this was a study that was comparing equivalent doses of rice and whey protein And ultimately, in this particular study, there was, again, no real difference in DEXA scans, fat-free mass, bench press 1 rep max. Again, importantly, they had achieved a high daily dietary protein intake. So in the context, so we've been focused now on a lot of the compositional and the amino acid content and potentially the leucine content being particularly important, but this is in the context of also a high total daily dietary protein intake. So when that is achieved, perhaps those other factors are less relevant overall in terms of adaptive responses over time. And then I thought this was obviously most of us are probably interested more in the strength and conditioning side of it, but I thought this was interesting as a paper in terms of other adaptive responses that may relate to, you know, a sport like soccer, which is very much a mix of oxidative and non-oxidative energy systems. And this was looking at a comparison of whey and soy protein, and, you know, benefits to both of these that were relatively equal in terms of less fatigue from high intensity running, less fatigue in terms of speed. So a couple of interesting endpoints that are not just jack biceps and bench press 1 rep max. So what can we do as far as, we mentioned that there's potential limiting factors in food that might actually dictate the ability of certainly sources of plant protein to influence some of these adaptive responses. This was a trial that looked at a wheat protein isolate at different doses. They had a 35-gram dose, they had a 60-gram dose, and then they were comparing it to whey at a 35-gram dose. They also had casein in this as well. And this was in healthy older men. And what was interesting about this trial was all of those components that we've discussed before were matched. Okay, the whole leucine thing, that was matched. The doses themselves matched. This was well controlled for these factors that we've so far been thinking these possibly are what's influencing outcomes. But what was interesting was with the wheat protein at 35 grams, there was the whey that really had much more of an impact. And the wheat protein at 35 grams, despite these other characteristics being matched, didn't have that effect. But when you actually upped it to 60 grams, then it started to have, certainly over 2 hours, a relatively similar response. This is protein, again, fractional synthesis rates, so muscle protein synthesis rates over 2 hours. Then interestingly, over 2 to 4 hours, the 60-gram dose of wheat protein isolate was significantly sustaining that elevation in synthesis rates. And so that could, again, potentially be because whey proteins tend to be quite fast-acting. But again, of note is the fact that in this particular study, a higher dose of the wheat protein, despite the fact that those other factors that we've been talking about, like leucine content or even just total dose of protein were accounted for, was still required. And again, this may relate to the population studied, older adults, potentially with more of a degree of anabolic resistance. That might require actually just more total dietary protein intake. And indeed, there's even some interesting research on specific indications for whey proteins and dairy proteins in this population. So what about other sources? So this is a group, Benjamin Wall's group, who've done some really interesting research into mycoproteins. So anyone who's had corn, it's a mycoprotein. And one of the fascinating things about this study, and this is coming back to a theme that one of the kind of seeds we planted at the start, is does leucine response or content, does it explain the entirety of the responses? Was what this compared was the mycoprotein to a milk protein. And what you can see here is, yeah, sure, that the milk protein got this big stimulus in actual plasma, in circulating leucine levels afterwards, right, compared to this mycoprotein. And so we would think, oh, great, so that's going to translate then, isn't it, into muscle protein synthesis and other adaptive outcomes. No. What ended up happening was the actual outcome that we're kind of interested in here in terms of myofibrillar fractional synthesis rate was significantly greater in the mycoprotein group, right? So this doesn't explain the full story. not in isolation. So yes, you can have this greater leucine kind of enrichment response, but no, it doesn't necessarily always translate. And this is where we're starting to potentially have to consider that there's other factors going on beyond just those simple kind of comparisons of matching leucine between groups. And one example came from this group, again, that really highlights this. So what they did was they took the mycoprotein and they had just the normal mycoprotein at a certain dose, and then they had the mycoprotein that they enriched with branched chain amino acids. And their thinking was, well, so we've got the same dose of these two mycoproteins, these two plant-sourced proteins. If we jack one up with BCAAs, we'll get more of a response because it's more amino acid rich, and we'll flood the circulation with more amino acids, and that's what we want. It's great. Not particularly. So if you look here, the open bars are the actual just normal mycoprotein dose, and then the dark bars are the enriched. And you can see, actually, it had less of an effect. Just the normal mycoprotein supplement without further branched chain amino acid enhancement had a greater effect in terms of when they were rested and then fed. Obviously in the fasted state, no particular difference. But what we're interested in is actually once you start the provision of these amino acids these foods in response to exercise, and you get this greater effect for the mycoprotein without enrichment. And that was both fractional synthesis rates. And so the story itself is not simply one of you flood the circulation with amino acids, you enrich any product with specific amino acids alone, and potentially there are some differences as it relates to the food matrix. Just to highlight how this isn't necessarily only a consideration for the plant versus animal protein debate, there's other research that has looked at this in comparing just within the class of animal proteins. So this was a study that compared beef to milk. And ultimately, with these, things that we're now, well familiar with, in terms of leucine content, total essential amino acid content, these two are pretty well matched. Okay, yeah, there's more carbohydrate intake in the skim milk and more energy, but as far as the amino acid, and that could explain some of the results here. But again, really consistent with what we know about the effect of kind of milk proteins in particular. So at rest, obviously no difference. 2 hours then after, in the 2-hour window after exercise, and we're looking at fractional synthesis rates again, you've got milk having a much greater response than the beef proteins, but then within the 2 to 5 hour window, you've got no difference between these protein sources. So, okay, yes, there is a difference in certain factors that could influence some of this outcome, but as far as this particular response goes, most of those variables that we've been considering as potentially deterministic are pretty equivalent between these two sources, and yet we're still seeing some form of difference, certainly in an early response. And this is within a class of animal proteins that would be high quality. So we've seen this in comparing whole eggs versus egg whites, where you get this much greater response, fractional synthesis, muscle protein synthesis rates, again, from whole eggs versus egg whites themselves. And this was despite the egg whites jacking up leucine levels in the circulation by 9% more than the whole eggs actually achieved. So it's not just we need this specific leucine dose. The dose is important, but it's not as simple as we need that dose, we need a certain amount of amino acids, we flood the circulation, and we get these responses. We're seeing these responses sometimes independent of the degree to which leucine elevates in the postprandial period. And we're seeing that there's difference in terms of the food itself being compared to. So the food matrix likely matters, but we don't have a huge amount of data, surprisingly, on the effects of actually feeding people whole foods in a post-exercise period and seeing what their responsiveness is in a whole food context rather than some of these isolated protein powders. So this, just to hammer home the point that it's not just flooding the system with amino acids, because we do know that milk proteins are particularly potent in this and stimulating both the kind of anabolic responses and adaptive responses. But this actually looked at enriching dairy itself and then comparing whey versus casein. And sure, again, plasma leucine, in terms of milk dairy proteins, big response here, but in terms of muscle protein synthesis, no real significant differences between between the enriched amino acid dairy and just the normal. So it's different to casein, sure. We might expect that casein kind of typically longer acting, but no difference to just enhancing a normal milk protein with more amino acids to kind of flood the system and get these responses. So there are food matrix effects that we don't quite fully understand in terms of the influence of some of these different protein composition supplements and foods. So as far as considering the evidence that we have so far, how do we improve the anabolic potential of plant proteins or for people consuming plant protein diets? So yes, the leucine content is important in terms of if it's a supplement itself, in terms of achieving that particular dose in that post-workout period. So you can, depending on the source of plant protein, really look to make sure that a certain threshold of leucine is being achieved with the dose of that particular plant protein. You can increase the total dose of both the supplement itself to facilitate that. These are kind of related. But you can also just make sure the total dose of daily protein intake is in the range that we would know is beneficial for adaptive responses, certainly to strength and resistance training. Mixing plant protein sources across a range of different foods and potentially even supplemental blends for people that are following an exclusively plant-based diet, and then for people that are following vegetarian diets, for example, or any iteration of vegetarian diet, there's nothing wrong with then mixing plant and animal protein sources to really kind of maximize a benefit. And that might relate just both to whole foods in the diet, and it might also relate to the supplemental choice of protein powder or supplement as well. One thing, this is kind of more for this is just big picture thinking about what we've come away with in terms of looking at these different interventions. We need to be granular. If we're working our way, this is just a heuristic for thinking about a lot of the different studies. We've seen studies that are in resistance-trained young men. We've seen studies that are in healthy older adults. So it's important to think about all of these factors, like what's the actual exposure itself? Is it diet or foods? If it's a supplement, has it considered some of these factors that we've been discussing? The actual mechanism, obviously muscle protein synthesis is important, but it's also a proxy outcome. So we need to be kind of a bit more granular then with thinking about outcomes that potentially are more relevant, like lean muscle accretion, strength and power performance, and adaptive responses. And we need to be really granular with thinking about what is the population that we're ultimately studying and how that might relate both to the intervention and whether it's sufficient, but also then in terms of the potential outcomes. Okay, so to summarize, the digestibility and availability of dietary amino acids is not settled science at this point. And yes, if we use these quality scores like the indispensable amino acid score, plant protein sources would overall, almost by default, be considered less quality than an animal protein source, certainly at the equivalent actual gram per gram dose. And so there's less anabolic potential if it's just a gram for gram comparison rather than considering some of these other factors. But these conceptual comparisons don't necessarily capture the training effects of plant proteins. And proxy outcomes like muscle protein synthesis or circulating leucine may not capture the performance adaptations that actually occur from that specific plant protein. Increasing the dose to provide more total essential amino acids and leucine in particular does produce ultimately similar effects when it's compared to a whey protein. So when those factors are accounted for, even when you can use something like a pea protein where the actual total dose of protein is used, you'll get equivalent responses from a pea versus a whey, for example. But more importantly, when total daily protein targets for exercise are met, it really seems that the source of the protein is less important overall. The beneficial effects are observed across a range of outcomes from hypertrophy and strength and even to some of these kind of endurance parameters that we saw in that study in soccer players. And personally, I think that this question of plant versus animal protein is the wrong question to ask because we see differential effects both within the classification of plant protein, I would say that a pea protein is a better choice than rice protein. But we can also say that within a class of animal proteins, there are some protein sources that appear to be better in terms of some of these responses than others. And none of that necessarily suggests that that has to be dichotomized in that way, because we consume mixed diets. So these factors are less relevant once we're thinking in terms of total dietary intake. The role and relevance of the food matrix is really something that needs to be fully elucidated. We have these suggestive studies that there are differential effects, even within like the egg study, for example, whole egg versus egg whites. And really not a lot of research has looked at food-based adaptive responses in the way that it has for isolated supplements. So we need to consider that if we're talking about some of these kind of plant versus animal sources of foods, we're really confined with most of the research to the difference in basically supplemental protein powders. We don't know if tofu is any better than Greek yogurt. So there are open questions. I think overall we can say that from a practical perspective, in terms of working with athletes, the most important aim is to make sure that they're consuming sufficient dietary protein intake relative to being engaged in strength and resistance training. And that total dietary protein intake is going to obviously then relate to their total energy intake in terms of whether they're in a hypocaloric or hypercaloric phase. And secondarily then, once that's accounted for, that the source of protein is less relevant. But I do think that we could say that there is some evidence that there may be better options within a class, both of animal and plant protein. And certainly for a plant protein, it is important to consider the amino acid enrichment and the leucine content of that to make sure that those thresholds, they are still important. They're not explaining the entirety of the response. And well, that's it, basically. I'll leave that slide up.